Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to introduce my subject of study and of investigations through the Marie Curie funding. Just before passing to the presentation, I would like to invite you as well to the next webinar. This is the 6th one, so the 7th one will be on the 16th of May, The Dark Side of Leadership, the abusive supervision in the workplace. Now, coming to myself, Michele Nori, I try to open up my presentation. I'm a tropical agronomist. I studied in Florence and I graduated in 1995. I've been working in the field for 18 years, and then as a tropical agronomist as an agronomist in tropical countries, and then I decided to come back to work in Europe, and I had to reverse my projection, my perception of the world, because when I came back to Europe, I understood that a large part of the workforce into the agricultural sector and the people living in rural areas, they definitely come from countries that are not European, or maybe that are from Eastern Europe. So it's this brought me to present a proposal to investigate about the presence of migrants, a foreign workforce, into European agriculture and countryside. So this is how I came up to this subject as an agronomist and through field perception, let's say. I then applied for the Marie Curie in 2012. I got my funding 2 years later, and I finished my engagement last year. So let me then come to the specific subject of concern, of my concern, and I hope of yours as well, the one of rural migrations, opportunities and challenges, because I feel this is a very fertile, still, after my Marie Curie grant, it is even more of a subject of an interest, because the presence and the contribution of migrants to EU agriculture is poorly considered, poorly acknowledged, and poorly understood as well. So the interface between agriculture and rural development and migration studies is, in my opinion, very fertile in academic as well as in policy terms. And it definitely addresses a key societal challenge, that is the one of sustainable rural development. Then let's try to move forward. In the recent decades, they've witnessed somehow quite of an intense restructuring of the agriculture in the EU as well as in the rest of the world. Main features in the European context are the one of the polarization in economic as well as in geographical terms between areas of higher potential and those of lower potential or marginal areas. And therefore, there's been an increase of investments in high potential areas and signs of abandonment and marginalization of more difficult territories, such as mountainous areas or dry land landscapes. In parallel, we've seen a decrease in overall figures of farming, specifically family farming. So we have a much smaller number of farms today, almost the half of what we had 30 years ago, and a restructuring as well of the farming place and architecture. And overall, we've also witnessed a kind of consistent decline and aging of the population living in the countryside and operating into agriculture. The picture is quite indicative of the image that we have of farmers today in the EU. In order to quantify this phenomenon, and throughout the presentation, I will always use the livestock sector as a reference. Here is the graph, a chart that indicates the trends of the figures of sheep in Europe. Sorry, just a minute. Please, sorry, I had a problem with my telephone on the other side. The figures about sheep presence in Europe, and as you might see, there's a quite consistent decrease through time. there's been a peak in the early 90s because of the accession of new countries that was going on, such as Bulgaria and Romania, where the number of sheep is quite consistent. But in the medium term, as you can see, the trend is quite on the negative side. And in order to go into a little bit more of detail about this process, what we see from this chart is that not only we had a decrease in the total amount of animals, but even the composition of the flocks and the herds. So the number of animals, the groups of animals have been somehow restructured in a different way. This is a case study from the French meat sector. Still, we are talking about sheep. And what we have after 30 years is that we have less farms with a larger size of flocks. So more animals concentrated. So in the overall, it is less animals concentrated in bigger groups, just to make things quite simpler. So the redistribution and the nature of the work has also changed quite consistently. The main phenomena that has counterbalanced this decline in farming as well as in the rural population is the inflow and the growing presence of foreign workers and the migrant workforce somehow that have come to live and operate in the European countryside and contribute to the agriculture production system. One of the first academics that has been working on this subject is Professor Kasimis from Greece, that in the 90s he started witnessing and investigating about the increasing presence of Albanians, that once the Albanian regime collapsed, they crossed somehow the mountains southern of Albania and came to Greece to inhabit and to contribute to the rural development of mountainous areas. It is very interesting because in the analysis of Kasimis, it's not only the agriculture production system that benefited somehow from the workforce, but the whole rural livelihoods. So in the villages, there were new children given birth, Albanians and Greek rural people got married, so the rate of intermarriage was quite high, and this produced a kind of positive demographic growth and dynamics in most of the villages that were otherwise abandoned. So immigration contributed somehow to tackle the mismatch between the local population that was out migrating and abandoning the countryside and the new population coming in and inhabiting those territories and villages. While the phenomenon of population decline and aging is consistent throughout Europe, it's even more relevant and consistent on the Mediterranean side of Europe. This is because in this part of the Union, the agricultural sector and the rural world plays a specific dimension, because it's not only about producing food, but it's also part of the local identity and represent a key. The agri-food sector represents a key element, a key item of the GDP and the national economies, and is a relevant part when it comes to tourism. There is also another sector that contributes quite largely to the national GDPs. The demographic trends in the rural areas are quite marked, and as we've seen in the map above, the darker areas means that the population is older. So the density of the blue goes with the average of people in the farming sector. And as we can see, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Romania and Bulgaria to an extent present with the highest number of old farmers, let's say. This means the youth out-migration from these areas is quite consistent. In these areas as well, immigration is a quite recent phenomena. If we think about Spain and Italy, they started in the 80s and in the 90s to start welcoming people coming from other continents, whereas in the northern parts of Europe, this was a process that has been already going on for decades. And this phenomenon is growing, is proceeding quite fast because of the geographical exposure to southern Europe to the Mediterranean basin. And this also brings us to think about the exposure to climate change and therefore the relevant agroecological changes that the whole region is undergoing. Two main phenomena that characterize the presence of migrants into EU agriculture and countryside is the fact that in time terms, this presence has been growing quite consistently in the last decade, meaning that during the financial crisis, the agricultural sector and the rural villages have been benefiting to a large extent by the growing presence of migrants, which have been quite critical in undertaking agricultural activities and the maintenance of the farming and the landscapes. So on this side, we can say that the migrant workforce has been a key element for the resilience of the agriculture sector and the rural world in Europe during the recent financial crisis. Just to go through these figures briefly, today about 1/3 of the salaried workforce in countries such as Spain and Italy are of foreign origin. So 1 every 3 salaried workers in agriculture come from another country. At the same time, talking about resilience, we can also say that the agriculture sector and the rural world have been quite key and critical features for the resilience of migrant communities during the crisis, because as employment and income opportunities decreased in the secondary and tertiary sectors, and the living conditions were becoming harder in urban areas, a huge number of migrant households and communities found their way through the countryside and could find an alternative source of living and working in agriculture. Second feature that is quite relevant this time in geographical terms is the presence, how do you say, the above the average presence of the overrepresentation, presence of migrants in communities that inhabit difficult or marginal territories. This means that when we go very often to mountainous areas, drylands, or the islands of the Mediterranean, the relative presence of migrants might be higher than in other areas of EU countryside. This is interesting because on one side it indicates that these areas have been more welcoming, despite what we can think about traditional habits, more welcoming than others, because the need for a new, fresh and young workforce was definitely higher than in the average. And on the other side, if we look into these figures, we can see and imagine that the projections could be easily that in the coming years and decades, this relative presence will be even higher, because the demographic figures when it comes to fertility rates and mortality rates go in favor of an increasing presence of migrant communities and contribution to difficult areas and difficult places. In this case, the figures are taken from the Strategia Nazionale Area Interna. That is a program from the Italian government to address the problem of demographic decline in internal and remote areas of the country. It's relevant to discuss about this feature because when it comes to mountainous areas, just let's make the example, the presence of people is relevant in a multi-purpose perspective, because it's not only about producing quality food, by the way, but it's also about taking care of the environment and the maintenance of the landscape. There are a number of societal threats associated to the abandonment of mountainous areas, to maintain the examples, such as the increase of fire events, floods, landslides, if the ecosystem and the landscapes are not properly managed. So it's quite relevant to maintain a strong, young and motivated workforce in difficult and marginal territories, so as to decrease the risk of threats coming from natural hazards. Here we go with some features that characterize the presence of migrants in EU agriculture. They are not in terms of relevance, but just one after the other. Most of the contractual relationships in these areas are quite informal, and the visibility of such workforce is limited, as much as their degree of precariousness is elevated, meaning that in this sector it is very hard to find the contractual arrangements that are official, formal, and regular. There's a kind of continuum between low and high skilled workforce. Think about people picking tomatoes in southern parts of Italy, or those taking care of large sheep flocks in the mountains of the Alps. In these cases, definitely the skills required are quite different, whereas in the first case, picking tomato might be a very hard work to be done in terms of technical skills. When you have to take care of a large flock on top of mountains where there is the snow, the wolf, and other kind of environmental hazards, the skills required are quite consistent. And this goes together with the definition between intensive and extensive or marginal areas and production systems. So there's a continuum. There are different degrees of contribution and of capacities brought by migrant communities and migrant workforce to the agricultural sector. There seems to be as well a phenomenon of specialization in ethnic, ecological, as well as economic terms, meaning that some communities are getting specifically engaged into some specific areas or production sectors. We will see that later on in a while with an example about the cheese value chains. Another quite critical indicator, though it comes from the data from 2009, but it's still a relevant feature of this phenomena, is the little capacity for migrants to upscale in socioeconomic terms, meaning that their effective capacity to upscale from a pure workforce to an entrepreneurial level are very limited nowadays, as figures go. Living conditions and working rights are also very limited. This goes back to the fact of being quite precarious. The presence of migrants in this sector and in these areas gives less problems when it comes to the competition over employment or housing, because of the limited interest of the local population. And the land that is being used through this system is very often, the alternative would be very often abandonment. And the last point is that there are indications of ongoing substitution rates, meaning that some communities are taking over other communities as conditions change, such as the Romanians have been taking over the workforce in many forest areas in central Italy as they became European citizens, and therefore they had less problems when it comes to visa and the documentation to be regular workers. But in the last years, we've also seen that as they are now fully recognized as European citizens, they might be less interested in undertaking forest activities because they can find opportunities or look for opportunities in other sectors. So every 10 years, let's say, there is a kind of restructuring of the relationship between the different groups and communities and the different territories and sectors. Here we go with another case study, the one of cheese making in Italy. As we know, for most of the Euro-Mediterranean countries, cheese is one of the key elements of the local traditional agri-food system and the culture more in general. And in very many of these value chains, the presence and contribution of migrants is quite relevant. Here we have 4 cheeses from Italy, where figures indicate that the presence and the contribution of migrants to the whole value chain, from the taking care of the animals to milk production and milking, to the processing of cheese, as much as to the commercialization. In this value chain, the presence and the contribution of migrants is quite relevant. In the case of Parmigiano, the community of SIC throughout the value chain plays a relevant role from taking care of the animals to taking care of the milk and the cheese. The same is to be said for the Fontina, where in Val d'Aosta, if we go up to the mountains, we can see that in the summertime, the animals are very often taken care of by Moroccan shepherds, and the milk is processed up to the mountains by the same shepherds. So they definitely contribute a huge amount of work value and work to this to the Fontina value chain. In the case of mozzarella di bufala in Campania, there are indications that without the presence of the Bengali communities, that value chain would be of little use today. And even when it comes to Sardinia and the value chain for pecorino, the presence of Romanian shepherds is an interesting case where a workforce, a skilled workforce coming from very far elsewhere in Europe is contributing to a typical production system of a Mediterranean island with different added value when it comes to the environment as well as the cultural settings. So in order to sum up, main features about the migrants' presence and contribution to EU countryside and agriculture are that today it is quite difficult to find local workforce that is interested in living and working in rural areas. And this despite the huge commitment of the European Union through the Common Agriculture Policy that represents about 40% of the overall EU budget. On the other side, we know that a young and motivated workforce is a key asset for a healthy and vital agriculture and for the resilience of the rural world, not only in terms of food production and rural livelihoods, but also in terms of taking care of the ecosystem and decrease the risk of natural hazards for the whole society. This brings us to believe that in the forthcoming reform of the Common Agriculture Policy that is foreseen for 2020, and where there is indication that we want to go towards a smart, sustainable and inclusive Europe, these features and these processes and these dynamics have definitely to be taken into consideration. Final slide about how can we do to take these elements and features into consideration. First, I think the main point is that in order to enhance the integration and the participation and the scaling up of migrants and the scaling up of migrants to EU agriculture, the main point is to work towards a more coherent and harmonized policy framework. This means that when we think about agriculture and rural development, we shall not overlook the impacts and the implications of policies that address issues such as the labor market, trade, and even more the one on migration. If we are not able to harmonize the agriculture and the migration policies, it will be very difficult for migrants to find their place to contribute in a consistent way to the sustainability of the agriculture sector. Some more specific and targeted initiatives in this respect could address the establishment of agriculture labor platforms that would enhance the matching between the demand and the offer, and as well monitor and control the capacity to go through official and formal contractual arrangements. So to avoid the gray areas that create the kind of social costs that we know about concerning the poor living and working conditions in the countryside for the migrant workforce. An observatory on agricultural land abandonment or land transfers could also be set up with a view to enhance the capacity of migrant communities to have access to land and therefore to enhance their capacity to scale up to a more entrepreneurial level. Some training modules could be thought about when it comes to technical and entrepreneurial capacities. My specific sector is the one of livestock, as I said, and there's definitely a need to adapt the skills and the knowledge of the incoming migrant communities to the specificities of the local territories. And as I said, in order to enhance the harmonization between the agriculture and migration policies, the idea would be to set up a legal framework that facilitates as well the capacity of rural immigrants to become citizens as we need and as they require. I thank you for your attention. I hope the issue was quite clear and of interest to you, and I'm waiting for your questions. I just have a final message to deliver, apart the fact that the next webinar will be on the 16th of May. You will receive afterwards some modules concerning an evaluation of this webinar, and we will be very, very grateful if you could answer, and we will take into account your kind considerations. Thank you very much. I go back to my face, if you allow, so that this could facilitate somehow more human touch. If you would like to address some questions specifically related to this presentation, please use the chat modality that is on top of your screen on the left side, so that these questions could directly be addressed to me. And meanwhile, I could try to use the remaining time, we still have a few minutes, in order to talk about my Marie Curie engagement. As I said, it started in 2014. I had the first year full-time, and the second year was put on a part-time basis, so that my whole engagement with Marie Curie was about 3 years. This gave me the opportunity to undertake more proper fieldwork activities during the second part of the research, and to have enough time to properly write papers and publications accordingly. If anybody's interested, there's a future of food security and rural livelihoods is the document that the DG Agri of the European Commission has recently released, and at page 16 there was a specific mention about migrants workforce. Thanks very much for your attention. I'm seeing there's no major questioning, so I hope everything was very, very clear, or maybe there's room for further questioning at a different stage. My email, if you want to remain in touch, and if you want to know more about my publications and the outcomes of this research, my email is indicated here. Thank you very much again for your attention.